All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we're diving into a debate that's going to make you think.
Yeah, this one is a real clash of the titans. We've got Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist and famous atheist, going head-to-head with Jordan Peterson.
You know, that clinical psychologist who's got everybody talking about religion and meaning and all that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
him. And the source material we're going to unpack is just wild. It's this YouTube video where they're debating whether Peterson actually believes that Jesus died for our sins.
Ooh, that's heavy stuff. We're talking about the nature of truth, the role of science and faith, and of course the big question of morality.
All that and more. So just to get everyone on the same page, Richard Dawkins is a huge name in evolutionary biology. He's known for books like The God Delusion, and he's a pretty strong advocate for a purely scientific worldview.
Right, and then you've got Jordan Peterson. He's a clinical psychologist and author who's gotten super popular for his lectures and books on psychology, meaning, and religion.
He's definitely become a bit of a controversial figure, especially when it comes to his views on Christianity.
And that's where this debate gets really interesting, because Peterson calls himself a cultural Christian.
Which is a bit of a head-scratcher, right?
Totally. He says he doesn't see Christianity as a literal truth system.
Yeah, so I'm already a little lost. What does that even mean?
Me too. It's like he's saying he values the ethical framework of Christianity, but he doesn't necessarily believe in the actual stories and doctrines.
It is a bit of a tricky position. I think he's saying that he sees value in the impact that Christian stories and symbols have had, particularly on Western civilization, but he doesn't necessarily take them as literal fact.
So it's more about the cultural legacy than the actual religious beliefs.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is exactly the kind of thing that Dawkins challenges him on.
I can imagine Dawkins doesn't let him off the hook easily.
Not at all.
No.
He keeps pushing Peterson to explain what exactly Christianity got right if he doesn't believe in the literal truth of it.
And that leads to a whole discussion about ethical hierarchies.
Yeah, it's basically the idea that different cultures have different systems of morality and that these systems have evolved over time.
Okay, so is he saying that some moral systems are better than others?
That's kind of what it sounds like. He argues that Christianity, for all its flaws, has pushed Western civilization toward a more sophisticated moral framework than some other religions that have some more brutal practices.
Okay, so I'm thinking about like ancient sacrifices and stuff like that.
Yeah, things like that. They actually use a very specific example in the video. They talk about Islamic fundamentalism versus Christianity.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty bold comparison.
It is, and Peterson uses it to make a pretty provocative point. He says that any progress towards mercy and tolerance is a bloody miracle considering our more primal aggressive instincts.
So it's like he's saying that any step away from our more basic violent tendencies is a win for humanity, regardless of whether the underlying beliefs are literally true.
Yeah, and that's where things start to get really heated because Dawkins obviously has a very different perspective.
Oh, I bet. And speaking of things that are likely to get Dawkins fired up, he brings up the virgin birth.
Oh boy, here we go. Dawkins just straight up asks Peterson point blank, do you believe in the virgin birth as a biological fact?
Oof, I can just feel the tension through the screen.
Yeah.
How does Peterson even respond to that?
Well, let's just say he doesn't give a simple yes or no. He goes off on this whole tangent about the metaphorical significance of the Virgin Mary, talking about the mother and child archetype and how societies that don't revere that archetype tend to die out.
Wait, hold on, back up a second. What's an archetype again?
It's this concept from psychology, basically. Yeah. Archetypes are these universal recurring patterns of thought and behavior that we see across cultures and throughout history. Like think of the hero, the villain, the wise old man. These are all archetypes.
Okay, right. So is Peterson saying that the Virgin Mary story is like tapping into this deep-seated archetype of the mother and child?
Exactly. He's suggesting that this archetype has some really profound psychological and social significance, and that's why the story has resonated with people for so long.
So is he saying that it doesn't matter if it actually happened historically?
That's what it sounds like. Which, of course, drives Dawkins absolutely crazy.
Because he's coming at it from a purely scientific perspective. Right?
Yeah.
If you can't prove it with evidence, then it's not true.
Exactly. And that's where we start to see the real heart of this debate. It's this clash between scientific truth, which Dawkins is all about, and Peterson's insistence that there's this deeper kind of truth that can be found in myth and metaphor.
And that clash becomes even more explicit when they start talking about the very definition of truth.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting.
So how does that play out? I mean, they're not exactly looking up truth in the dictionary, are they?
Not quite.
Yeah.
But they definitely lay out their positions pretty clearly.
I'm all ears.
So Dawkins, as you might expect, puts scientific truth on a pedestal. He's talking about the age of the universe, the success of landing a spacecraft on a comet. These are the kinds of facts that he sees as the most important.
Okay, so far so good. It's hard to argue with the laws of physics.
Right. But then Peterson throws a curveball. He argues that even the act of prioritizing those kinds of facts, that's a value judgment in itself, something that science can't fully account for.
Whoa. Okay, my brain just did a backflip. So he's saying that even science is built on a foundation of values and assumptions that go beyond pure observation.
Exactly. He even says, and this is a great quote, "We cannot orient ourselves in the world merely in consequence of facts."
So he's saying that there's more to life than just collecting data points.
Right. We need something more to guide our actions, our choices, our understanding of the world. And he's suggesting that science, while it's obviously incredibly valuable, can't be the only source of truth or meaning.
I mean, science can't tell us what to value or how to live or what our purpose is right.
Exactly. And to illustrate this point, they actually have this little side conversation about Dostoevsky and Disney.
What? Dostoevsky and Disney? How does that even come up?
Well, Dawkins is arguing that great fiction like Dostoevsky's work is valuable because it gives us insight into human nature, not because it reveals some kind of scientific truth.
So he's basically saying, yeah, stories can be insightful, but they're not on the same level as scientific facts when it comes to understanding the world.
Right. But Peterson's point about archetypes kind of complicates that, doesn't it? If those stories are tapping into something universal about the human experience, then doesn't that give them a kind of truth, even if it's not a scientific truth?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And that's where things get really philosophical. But they bring it back down to earth with a really interesting example, the oppression of women.
Oh, yeah. That's a topic that always gets people talking.
For sure. So how does the oppression of women fit into a debate about science and religion?
Well, Peterson argues that the Judeo-Christian idea of both genders bearing God's image was a pretty revolutionary concept for its time. It inherently values people regardless of gender based on this shared divine connection, and then he throws down this challenge. How do you argue for women's equality on purely factual scientific grounds?
It is a tricky one. I mean, you could scientifically document biological differences between men and women, but that doesn't tell you how they should be treated.
Exactly, and that's Peterson's point. He's highlighting the limitations of a purely scientific worldview when it comes to moral questions. Science can tell us what is, but it can't tell us what ought to be.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all ties together. Dawkins is all about scientific truth, which is powerful and important, but Peterson is arguing that we need something more than just facts to navigate the world. We need values, meaning a sense of purpose. And he sees those things as coming from something beyond the realm of science.
It's like they're each holding a piece of the puzzle, but neither piece completes the picture on its own.
So it's not about choosing one over the other, but figuring out how they fit together.
Right. It's like Dawkins is looking at the world as this giant machine that we can understand through scientific inquiry, while Peterson sees it as a tapestry woven from narratives and archetypes.
That's a great analogy. And it really gets to the core question of this whole debate. Can these two perspectives coexist? Can we appreciate the power of science while also acknowledging the human need for meaning and purpose, which often finds expression through stories, symbols, and even religious beliefs?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one that we're going to keep exploring as we dive deeper into this debate.
So stay tuned, because things are about to get even more interesting. So how does that play out? I mean, they're not exactly looking up truth in the dictionary, are they?
Not quite, but they do lay out their positions.
Okay, so Dawkins being Dawkins, I'm guessing he's all about that scientific truth.
You know, he puts it right up on a pedestal. He's talking about stuff like the age of the universe, or like successfully landing a spacecraft on a comet. You know, those hard facts.
Yeah, those are pretty solid. It's hard to argue with stuff like that.
Right. But then Peterson throws in this curveball.
Oh boy, I bet.
He basically says that even choosing to focus on those kinds of facts, that in itself is a value judgment.
Whoa, okay, wait. So he's saying science can't fully explain why we prioritize those facts in the first place.
Yeah. Like science can't tell us what's ultimately important or valuable. It's like he says, we can't figure out how to live just based on facts.
So there's more to life than just those data points.
Right. And Peterson is saying that science, while it's super valuable, it can't be the only way we figure out truth or meaning.
It can't tell us what to value or how to live or even what our purpose is.
Exactly. And they actually have this little side conversation about Dostoevsky and Disney that I think illustrates this point.
Dostoevsky and Disney. Okay, now I'm really curious. How did that come up?
Well, Dawkins is arguing that great fiction, like Dostoevsky's work, is valuable because it gives us insight into human nature.
Okay, but not because it reveals some kind of scientific truth.
Right. He's saying those stories can be insightful, but they're not on the same level as scientific facts when it comes to understanding the world.
But then doesn't Peterson's whole point about archetypes complicate that? Like, if those stories are tapping into something universal about being human, then doesn't that mean there's a kind of truth in them?
It's a great question, and it shows just how deep this philosophical divide goes. It could get super abstract and heady, but they bring it back down to earth with a really interesting example. They start talking about the oppression of women.
Now that's a topic that's guaranteed to get people talking.
It definitely does. And this is where I think the tension between scientific reasoning and moral judgments becomes really obvious.
Okay, so how does the oppression of women fit into a debate about science and religion?
Well, Peterson argues that the Judeo-Christian idea of both genders bearing God's image was revolutionary for its time. It inherently values people regardless of gender because of this shared divine connection. And then he kind of throws down this gauntlet. He asks, how can you argue for women's equality just based on facts?
That is a tough one. I mean, obviously there are biological differences between men and women, but that doesn't tell you how they should be treated.
Exactly. And that's what Peterson is getting at. He's saying a purely scientific worldview can't fully address moral questions. Science can tell us what is, but not what ought to be.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects. Dawkins is all about scientific truth, which is really powerful and undeniable. But Peterson is arguing that we need more than facts to navigate the world. We need values, meaning a sense of purpose.
And he thinks those things come from something beyond the realm of science.
So it's not about choosing one over the other, but figuring out how they fit together.
Right. It's like Dawkins sees the world as this giant machine that we can figure out through science, but Peterson sees it as this tapestry of stories and archetypes.
That's such a great way to put it. And it leads us to the biggest question of this whole debate. Can these two perspectives coexist? Like, can we appreciate the power of science, but also recognize that humans crave meaning and purpose?
And that those things often come from stories, symbols, and even religious beliefs.
So maybe it's not about science versus religion, but science and religion.
That's a great way to think about it. It's not an either situation. Maybe we need both to really understand the world.
That reminds me of that famous Einstein quote, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind."
Exactly. Maybe we need both the rigor of scientific thinking and the wisdom of those ancient stories and myths to really navigate this crazy world.
So we don't have to choose sides.
Maybe not. Maybe it's more about recognizing that both perspectives have something valuable to offer.
That's a really interesting thought. And it brings us to the final and maybe the most important question of this whole deep dive. Can we actually reconcile scientific truth with the power of myth and metaphor?
Can we embrace the insights of both Dawkins and Peterson without having to pick a side?
Or are these just fundamentally different ways of seeing the world that are always going to be in tension?
I don't have the answer, but this whole conversation has definitely got me thinking.
Me too.
Yeah.
And that's what we want, right? To spark curiosity and get people questioning their own assumptions.
Exactly. We're not here to give you all the answers, but to encourage you to keep exploring these complex ideas.
So keep those brains buzzing and keep diving deep, because there's always more to discover. Where does this all leave us, though? I mean, we've gone through all these complex ideas, these passionate arguments.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is. So how do we apply this to our own lives? What are we supposed to do with all this Dawkins versus Peterson stuff?
Well, that's the real challenge, right? Hopefully this deep dive has given you some new ways to think about the world. Maybe you're seeing the limits of a purely scientific perspective.
Or maybe you're thinking differently about the role of myth and metaphor in your own life.
Exactly.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in those either debates, science versus religion, facts versus values, logic versus emotion.
Right. Like we have to choose a side.
Yeah, but what if it's not that simple? What if we're missing something by taking sides?
What if instead of seeing these as opposing forces, we realize they can coexist?
Like, we can appreciate science, but also recognize that we need meaning and purpose.
And that those things often come from stories, symbols, even religious beliefs.
You know, that reminds me of that Einstein quote, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind."
Oh, that's a good one.
It's like we need both the rigor of scientific thinking and the wisdom of those old myths and stories to really make sense of the world.
It's a powerful thought.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it leads to that final question, the big one for this whole deep dive. Can we actually reconcile scientific truth with the power of myth and metaphor?
Can we take the best of both Dawkins and Peterson without having to choose one over the other?
Or are these just totally different ways of seeing the world that will always clash?
I don't know the answer, but this whole conversation has really gotten me thinking.
Me too.
You.
And that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
Making us think, making us question our own assumptions.
Exactly. We're not here to give you all the answers,
But we are here to get those brain cells firing.
and to encourage you to keep exploring these ideas long after this deep dive is over.
So keep those brains buzzing, keep questioning, keep diving deep, and until next time, keep searching for those aha moments wherever you can find them.